Support for Race Unwrapped comes from the Kentucky Center for African American Heritage. Their mission is to enhance the public's knowledge of the history, heritage, and cultural contribution of African Americans in Kentucky and the African diaspora. KCAAH is dedicated to providing a heritage experience through education, enrichment, and entertainment. Located at 1701 West Muhammad Ali Boulevard. Calendar of events and more at kcaah.org.
From Louisville Public Media.
Welcome to Race Unwrapped. I'm Michelle Tyreen Johnson. Langston Hughes, Zora Neale Hurston, Duke Ellington, Bessie Smith, Jacob Lawrence. If this were a clue on Jeopardy, the question would be, what is the Harlem Renaissance? This whole season has been about art as protest, art as representation, art as celebration and joy for artists of color. And we can't meaningfully talk about the subject without at least touching on that period of African American creativity and excellence from about 100 years ago. Dr. Minkah Makalani is an associate professor at Johns Hopkins University and director of their Center for Africana Studies. He joins us to talk about this incredible part of history and how art from the Harlem Renaissance is part of the DNA of Black artists today. So tell me a little bit about your area of expertise as it relates to the Harlem Renaissance.
So I'm an intellectual historian who works on social movements, artists and activists, and their involvement in ideas about politics, progress, racial oppression, liberation. And my first book was on the grouping of Black activist intellectuals who joined the Communist Party. And this is in Harlem, but then I follow them as they travel into Europe and follow a group of those who settle in London in the mid-1930s. And so I'm talking about these activist intellectuals in the context of the Harlem Renaissance, or what I like to refer to as the New Negro movement, to capture kind of the range of what occurs in what we think about as the Harlem Renaissance. So this is both the artistic production that we tend to think about with the Harlem Renaissance in terms of the literary production of people like Langston Hughes, Claude McKay, et cetera, Zora Neale Hurston, as well as the political activism and organizing that many of these people were involved in. And so Claude McKay is one of those figures who is well known as a Harlem Renaissance poet, a novelist. He was also a political radical from Jamaica, actually travels first to what is now Kansas State to attend university, and then moves to Harlem and becomes involved in the Communist Party, the Communist International, travels internationally, and then spends time in Marseille and other places in Europe as he's writing a number of novels. So we kind of know him most for his If We Must Die poem. But he also has a number of novels that have been, some of them have been unearthed posthumously. So that's kind of the where my work falls and how it covers that Harlem Renaissance period. But I'm also now working on questions of art and politics and democracy in the Caribbean in the 1950s and 60s. So I kind of consider myself kind of covering the early 20th to the mid 20th century.
And it's funny because what you have said in both what you have studied and what you're currently working on link the two things that this whole discussion, I think, is about: arts and politics. And
Yes.
how politics are something that great artists and maybe not so great artists deal with, whether they think they are or not, and how politics is best played, I think, when it has sort of artistic sign-off, so to speak. Does
Right.
that make sense? I think about
Yeah, it does.
I think about like even today's modern political machinery. And we think about the national conventions, and the whole thing is, ooh, who's going to be at the national convention? Who's going to sing?
Right.
Who's going to,
Right.
because those things are so aligned. I remember when there was a rumor that Beyonce was going to appear at the
Mm,
Democratic National Convention, and everybody's looking online and seeing rumors, and then she shows up, but she doesn't
right.
sing.
Yeah, yeah,
And I just
yeah.
thought how interesting that she's being political, so to speak,
Hmm.
but all people are focused on is, but is she gonna sing something?
Right. Right. Well, I mean, I think this is, you mentioned the conventions, and this is kind of a really good encapsulation of what I would say is this overlap or the lack of a distinction between art and politics. I think there's a way that we tend to view politics as this pure area that gets into the nuts and bolts of how we live, how our government functions, how decisions are made, how policies are implemented, and so forth. There's obviously legitimacy to that view, but I think when we think of politics as kind of simply that and disengage from it, divorce from art, culture, I think we get a very diminished view of what politics can be. And so the tendency then is to focus on politicians. And
Right.
then we also get a diminished view of what art is. And so if, thinking about conventions, I can't remember the Democratic convention. I think it was for Obama's second run
Mm.
for Congress. It may have been something else, but there was a lot of chatter about Cory Booker being tapped as the predecessor to follow in Obama's footsteps.
Mm.
And his performance was just horrible when he gave an address. And I remember thinking, if he was in the running to be the one to pick up that mantle, he's totally out now because he just did not perform well. And he
Yeah.
was. I think people kind of immediately talked about that. And that is a question of the art form of oratory, how one
Mm.
commands a crowd, so forth and so on. And when we think about, and this is, I'm not the first one to say this. I think it's this scholar of education who works on hip hop. I want to say Christopher Emden, but I may be wrong about the name. But when we think about those people who the current era that we know of that are these orators who have a command of language and a charisma and an ability to captivate an audience, that think the two most prominent examples are those who are ministers, preachers, and
Yes.
hip hop artists. And maybe
Mm.
we can extend that more generally to someone like a Beyonce. So those artists in the realm of music. And it isn't that whatever an artist does is political and we have to think about it in these strict political terms, but that they are doing kind of what we want or what we think politicians should do. And that is to communicate with us. That is to capture and distill ideas and emotions and desires and aspirations into this form that we can then get behind them and vote for them or whatnot. But I think even with that, and that example, to as a way to understand what politicians do, I think it still offers us a very limited understanding of what politics is. And that's why the Harlem Renaissance slash New Negro movement, I think, is such a robust and underappreciated era in that when we think about, in particular, Black people's relationship to the United States and our position historically within the United States, we've been excluded and only kind of included in formal politics or formal political operations since the mid 1960s. And that was after fighting tooth and nail, people sacrificing their lives to be included as full citizens in the United States. And so one way to think about that is the United States has been a democracy only since 1965,
Hmm.
only since we have the extension of voting rights and protections to all U.S. citizens, right? But if we look at what Black people have done in the period from our arrival in 1619, if we want to take Nicole Hannah Jones's important work, and then carry that forward into 1965, we are looking in those areas where, because we've been excluded from these formal political realms, we've created our own form of
Yeah.
validation, our own
True.
forums to debate certain questions. And so, how do we work out what is a concern? What is a political project? And that's been in churches, not in this kind of romanticized notion of everything happened in the church was positive, because a lot of churches oppose political movements, and Black newspapers and Black magazines, orators. So when we think about Frederick Douglass, and we just had the 4th of July, and a lot of people circulated his "What to the
Yep.
Slave is the 4th of July." That is a masterful piece of oratory. You can follow that performance, that artistic performance of that political argument that he makes, with another masterful piece of Black oratory. And this is Booker T. Washington's Atlanta Compromise speech, which ushers in a certain kind of accommodationist politics. And then you have, in 1903, Du Bois publishes The Souls of Black Folk, not the best orator, but you can't argue with his pen game. And that really sets the stage in terms of public debate that involves questions of art. And then you begin to see in so many forums the issue of politics, art. These things are held together seamlessly. Now, I think what also we have to then take account of is the masses of Black people. What are they gravitating towards? They're reading and they're talking about these things, but they're also listening to the blues, spirituals. They're reading poetry. They're developing, less regarded poetic forms. So the dozens,
The dozens.
cap, and
Yeah.
these ways that people talk in beauty
Yes.
shops and barbershop, beauty salons and barbershops, and over a drink or in a bar. All of these things are kind of that cultural matrix that I think makes up that new Negro movement.
So
And
true.
when we think about that period, I think the other thing to really grapple with is that this is the first generation where people haven't been born in or connected to slavery in an experiential way.
That makes
Their
sense.
parents may have been, or grandparents may have been enslaved. Du Bois, I think, is born a couple of years before the end of slavery. I forget, or maybe a couple of years after. It's a very close proximity, but this is the first generation that is born after the enslavement of Black people in the United States. Now, you have folks coming from other places. Well, I think Cuba, slavery is abolished in 1888. So you have people who are coming from the Caribbean who have experiences with slavery. They may have been enslaved as a child. So this is that first generation where we are nominally free in that we aren't held in bondage. And so how are we creating politics? How are we creating art? And I think what's so important and exciting about thinking about and dealing with this period is that we are doing them all at once. People aren't thinking about them separately. People are Du Bois helping establish the NAACP, founding Crisis Magazine, writing poetry, writing short stories. Langston Hughes involved in a number of different political formations, but known as a poet. His first poem, "The
Yeah.
Negro Speaks a River," is published in Crisis Magazine. So you have all of this interplay between art and politics that it's really difficult in this period to talk about them separately. And scholars have magically achieved that unachievable feat. But I think that's what is so good about this discussion and these series of interviews that you've had, is that regardless of how it's been talked about in scholarship, sometimes very well, sometimes not so well, you see that the artists themselves are actually still crossing those boundaries. And I think that's what's really rich about looking at art and politics.
And from a cultural standpoint, it's just so you're so right that you can't unbreak the bond. But that's the thing, you know, several cultures have this. I've
Mhm.
I've only been Black. That's the only one I personally know about.
Right,
And
right.
what I love about being a Black artist and a Black journalist
Mhm.
is that we're always reinventing the game. You know,
Yeah.
we are we
Mhm.
and and it's hard to have a conversation, I think, about anything truly important in this country without at some point or another getting to how the culture approaches it.
Right.
And anything that's had a major change in our society has been because the culture has changed, has moved, has flowed around, has flowed under. I think about something even I've used this example so many times. Anybody who listens to this podcast probably is sick of this example, but litter. I think about growing up and how it was just so easy to toss things out of a car. People threw
Oh,
their
yeah.
trash out of a car all the time, and now you gasp on the very rare times that you see somebody do that, and that's because of a cultural shift. That isn't just because
Yeah.
of the law, right? I mean,
Right.
it's against the law to murder people. Folks still murder. We can go down a
Right.
list of things, but the cultural shift, and so oftentimes
Hmm.
race and culture are looked at as synonymous. So
Yeah.
how do you think that the Harlem Renaissance is influenced where we are today from an artistic and racial and cultural lens?
That's a really good question. So I think there is this long history, and it kind of, in some ways, it is solidified during that Harlem Renaissance New Negro period, where there's a long-standing view of Black people as not just racially inferior, but inferior in particular kinds of ways. So an intellectual inferiority that some would argue you see in a lack of reason, a lack of the ability to sustain the kind of work that occurs in science. But you see, and this is I'm parroting, what the
Hmm.
racists would say in
What the
the
racists would
90,
say.
the 18,
Let's
19,
be clear what
yeah,
the racists would
yeah,
say.
not what I would say, but but that you see Black people guided by passion.
Mm,
And so this is what accounts for their artistic ability,
mm. Yeah, I
is
can see
that they
that.
have this
Hmm.
passion. And so and it gets feminized as
Mm,
Black people are, as a race, are feminine. They're given the passion as opposed to reason, which is a masculine realm. And this is why we see them producing art or dancing, so forth and so on. Now, I mean, the ridiculousness of this is that it is, actually, a friend just pointed this out to me. We were talking about the Odyssey, the movie coming up,
mm,
and
mhm,
he had his son. They were in Greece, and so he had his son reading the Odyssey. And in the very early on in the book, someone is talking about the ivory and the furnishings that they brought back to Greece from Ethiopia. And so this movement into the Mediterranean being this area that included Africa, and that you're seeing science, you're seeing not merely diminished forms of culture in the sense of during enslavement, dance and singing and forcing those who are enslaved to perform in these stereotypical ways, but this much longer history where Europeans are interacting, or what we would call Europeans are interacting with Ethiopians and Egyptians in ways that belie this notion of a kind of political and intellectual racial inferiority. But then during the period of enslavement and colonization, when people are quite literally killed for reading or punished severely
mm,
for reading or trying to exercise political will, in that I don't want to be enslaved anymore. I'm going to run away. If you hit me, I'm going to try and kill you. So, then so that they are forced to sing and dance becomes the marker of what distinguishes Black people racially. And so that
mm,
art are those kind of activities are seen as feminine. And then in some instances, they're even described as that element of Blackness. So it's this, where the arts are always seen as diminished, cultural practices are always seen as diminished and not really what drives humanity forward. And I think what the Harlem Renaissance does is, to a certain degree, it tries to prove the humanity of Black people on the basis of high artistic production. So we're going to produce novels, poetry, very complex poetry. We're going to, with Oscar Michaud, produce films that are going to grapple with some of the
Don't
most,
forget theater.
theater. Some of the most important political
Yeah.
figures in the Harlem Renaissance. A. Philip Randolph, who is one of the architects of both the 1941 March on Washington movement and the 1963 March on Washington, which actually happened, was a stage performer. So you have this range of artistic production, and the historian David Levering Lewis describes this as an attempt to achieve civil rights by copyright. So we would demonstrate,
Interesting.
we would demonstrate our humanity and our fitness for equality through artistic production. Now that sits alongside those who argue for radical political programs as well as more mainstream political negotiation. So you have a range of responses to exclusion, to racist stereotypes in the Harlem Renaissance. In a way, it seems to substantiate the racist ideas about Black people. Well, of course, they're able to produce this artwork because they are kind of genetically inclined to that, right? Josephine Baker comes from St. Louis, ends up in France, and she's presented as this kind of embodiment of this African essence or this Black essence. So her outfits are kind of invoking this image of a primitive African, and she's engaged in a range of different performances, which both try to belie that, but also play on it. So I think this is the period when you have that happening in different levels. So people are using what is available to them, kind of the terrain that's been conscripted to Black people, to challenge those racial norms, those racial logics. But then it kind of reinforces it. And I think one of the ways that this kind of plays out in its most dynamic and interesting is that with boxing. So you have boxing is seen as, the sweet science. This is where Europeans and whites are demonstrating and embracing their manhood, their ability to train themselves and master this martial art. And Black people can't do that, obviously. But then you have Joe Louis, Jack Johnson becomes heavyweight champ, and then he's brought up on charges of white slavery, trafficking of white women across state lines. And then later you have Joe. And so then the racial script changes, that Black people are also genetically gifted
I was going to
at
say
sports.
that. I was going to say
Right.
that, but isn't that the case though, right? Like whatever, like,
Yeah.
oh, it's art. Of course y'all are good at arts. That's about passion. That's not about intellectual prowess, right?
Right.
Then it's sports. Well, y'all are just physically built differently, right? Like,
Right.
Well, then and I'm specifically thinking Black folks, when Black folks, beat someone's ass intellectually in a profession, then it's like, well, that was DEI. That was affirmative
Yeah.
action.
Right.
Yeah,
Right.
but that person still outsmarted you and came up with the fill in the blank. They invented
Yes.
the fill in the blank. They came up with the
Yes.
solution to fill in the blank. So like what is it? What
Right.
is it that we're really inferior at? I'm waiting.
Right, exactly. And when you sit back and look at this and you see that after the end of slavery and then this long struggle to be included as full citizens, along with struggles to end colonial domination, and all of this is all bound up with these racist notions. So are those in the British Caribbean, have they matured to the point, have we cultivated them to the point where they can govern themselves? Can these African nations actually govern themselves? Do they know democracy? Do they have the resources for democracy? And again, if we're thinking about the United States, if democracy is voting, and that's a very limited notion of democracy in politics, but if that's democracy, then the United States doesn't have a very long history with it, right? White
Right.
folks in the US don't have a very long history with it. France, going through over the past 400 or 500 years, republics, dictatorships, So what are we really talking about when we say that they are the example? But then every time Black people achieve something, it gets, the terms are changed. The rug is pulled out from under our feet. And so the question becomes, and I think a lot of people during the Harlem Renaissance were asking this as well. Do we accept these terms as the basis of inclusion? Do we accept these terms as the basis of struggle? So on the one hand, you had a group that presumed if we can demonstrate our mastery of cultural forms, these European cultural forms, and it's not to diminish those achievements, but you think about the Fifth Jubilee singers and what they are doing, and you listen to recordings of it, you just see, you can hear and feel this powerful artistic expression that is trained. It's a very disciplined art form. When you read the poetry, when you read the novels, all of these things, you see people are mastering these art forms. But then there are those who say, is this the basis upon which we should hinge our freedom? Accepting the terms, the racist terms that those in power have set out. And we see this today with all these machinations and claims about DEI, and people are only in these positions in the military because of DEI. They only hold these positions at universities because of DEI. And it's just like, well, white men make up what, 35% of the population, and they occupy somewhere on the order of like 80% of positions in different industries, sometimes 90, 95. So that I just refuse to believe, and no one has provided the evidence to support that they are just so intellectually superior that this is the reason why they're in these positions, and women, Black people, other people of color are excluded from them. And that's because we have a long tradition of questioning the logic of that. And it comes out in the art too. And I think when we get into the blues, when we get into the spirituals, what Toni Morrison captures so well in her novels, what Zora Neale Hurston is really capturing in her work, we see a whole host of people during the Harlem Renaissance, in that period, in the teens, 20s, 30s, 40s, who reject that logic as a basis for our humanity and our freedom. And I think that's the part that doesn't get talked about enough when we think about the Harlem Renaissance.
It's such a great point, and I feel like we're experiencing some degree of that now. What I can most appreciate is that no matter what's happening politically or socially, the Black
Hmm.
artists don't stop. Don't stop, won't
Yeah.
stop, keep
Yeah.
on moving, keep on
Hmm.
pushing, and
Hmm.
excel at it. Excel at it in ways that it's not just us listening to us. And
Right.
that's pretty amazing. So I'm going to wrap this up with a question that I am asking all the guests, and it is this. Ready for it?
Okay. Yes,
What is
I listen.
so you already know, you
Yeah.
listen.
I know what's coming.
You know it's coming. What is your favorite protest song?
Okay. Because I had a little bit of time to think about this, and
Okay.
I was stumped. I'm a kid of the 80s, and my first go-to was Public Enemy's Fight the Power, and that
Mm,
opening scene from Do the Right Thing.
yes.
But I had a little bit of time to think about it, and two other songs came up to me that I wanted to make sure I mentioned. And one is by Haitian American artist Layla Makala. She was a member of the Carolina Chocolate Drops,
Hmm.
which Rihanna Gittens was also a part of. And that's how I first heard of her. But then
Okay.
she branched out on her own. And she has an album, I think one of her first solo albums, which is inspired by Langston Hughes' poetry. And it's both some of his poems and then these Haitian folk songs. And one of the songs on there, it took me a while to kind of work out what she's singing in Creole, but it's this song, Merci Bonjour. And I'm probably mispronouncing that,
Mm.
but it's thank you, good God, or good Lord. And it's this lamentation about all these struggles that people are confronting, but then all these possibilities that are before them. And it's a very beautiful song just to listen to, not understanding Creole at all, but just to
Right.
hear it sung in the way that she renders it is just amazing. And the other one is, I don't remember the name. I want to say it's Triptych. And this is Abby Lincoln. And it's where she basically just vocalizes this guttural pain that kind of begins as a lament and it builds up and it kind of reflects the 1960s, those struggles, the pain that you hear in Nina Simone, Mississippi Goddamn. She captures in this song, but there's not a word in it. It's just her vocalization of, I take it as aspiration and pain and struggle and determination. So those are my three that I would put out there.
Of course, a professor would have researched the show,
Yes.
researched the question, and have three very strong choices for the question asked. Every professor that I know would be very proud of you, and I know a lot of
Well,
professors.
good. Yes, I'm not nimble on my feet, so I have to research and know what I'm saying.
Well, this has been great. I am so glad that we got to do this.
Yes, thank you.
Thanks to Dr. Minkah Makalani for that great conversation. Next time, we'll talk with poet and ornithologist Dr. J. Drew Lanham. I'm Michelle Tyreen Johnson, and this is Race Unwrapped.
Race Unwrapped is produced by Michelle Tyreen Johnson for Louisville Public Media. Music by Allison Cross. Our executive producer is Laura Ellis. For more information, to contact us, or to support Race Unwrapped, visit raceunwrapped.org. From Louisville Public Media.
Support for Race Unwrapped comes from the Kentucky Center for African American Heritage. Their mission is to enhance the public's knowledge of the history, heritage, and cultural contribution of African Americans in Kentucky and the African diaspora. KCAAH is dedicated to providing a heritage experience through education, enrichment, and entertainment. Located at 1701 West Muhammad Ali Boulevard. Calendar of events and more at kcaah.org.